What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Aliens Dark Descent, a real-time with pause TRPG, which is a rare thing, that of course uses the Aliens franchise as its base, which is overall a pretty interesting presentation. But before we start diving into that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that I cover, there's a video linked in the description that will go over all of it. My Steam profile is also public and linked below as well. In addition to that, I do have to tell you that I'm able to bring you this review a day after the game released, as I was provided a review copy by the publisher, Focus Entertainment. Though with that said, let's actually dive into this thing. As I mentioned, this is a real-time with pause or potentially just slow TRPG, which implies tactical real-time combat that will usually see us maintaining a base alongside our units at the same time. Gameplay-wise, this sees us controlling a unit of 4 to 5 Marines as they try to complete objectives against a planetary invasion of Lethe. And while the game isn't exactly perfect, it does do a lot of really interesting things that bring some fresh ideas to the TRPG space while retaining a degree of familiarity. As with all new releases, I do like to start these videos off with a mention of how the game is performing on a technical level, and on that front, I've had the game for about a week, and at first the game was crashing semi-regularly, which had me concerned. However, after having the game a few days, a driver update was made available for this game in particular with NVIDIA, and installing that driver actually appeared to fix the crashing problems. What it did not fix, however, were mostly minor bugs. A common one you'll see is textures popping in and out, alongside pathing issues where the Marines of your squad don't want to move with the rest of your squad or they get hung on the environment. Though probably most serious of all was a bug I don't want to explain in detail or show for that matter because it was the very last part of the game, but I ran into a bug in the final sequence of the title that resulted in the ending lacking the suspense it was going for, which involved some of the character models bugging out a little bit as they attempted to move in. Overall though, I would say the game was in a pretty good place for me personally. I have seen some of the early reviews mention more serious problems with the crashing and things like that, but for me the biggest problems were solved merely by updating my own graphics driver. Next up, I want to talk about the difficulty of the game. The game itself will tell you that this game is difficult, and overall I would agree with that assessment. Thanks to both the nature of the title, as we are going up against the ever-deadly aliens across every franchise that they are in, I think it would be kind of silly if we were just dominating them. So while there are a variety of difficulty options, which we'll mention here, the game is, generally speaking, a bit more difficult than you might be expecting, especially before you get to grips with all of the mechanics. Once you kind of understand how everything works, you'll probably be okay, but given the real-time nature of it and several other mechanics that involve how the aliens work, makes me think, as someone who plays these games all the time, that a lot of people might struggle even on normal. With that in mind, however, difficulty is modular. As you can see on screen here, we can pick presets from up to Story to Nightmare, which will affect a variety of things like enemy health, detection time, aggressiveness, as well as the campaign timer that comes into play about halfway through. Separately, however, we have the save system. You won't be making manual saves in this game, however, we have an option between permissive or no one can hear you scream mode. Permissive basically means that every time you complete some sort of objective, the game will auto-save for you, and many of these will be available all at once. On the harder version of this, only 2 autosaves are available, one of which being at your base, and the second one of which being every time you rest on a mission. Luckily though, you can go with a custom setting, mix and match some of these. Personally, I ran through the game twice, once on medium with the harder autosaves, and once on Nightmare with the easier autosaves. So if you're having trouble, I would recommend adjusting these a little bit, because I do agree the game is a bit more difficult than some people might be expecting, even if you're familiar with the genre. From there, let's talk about the story setup and my thoughts. That said, I'm going to try to make sure there are as few spoilers as possible here, outside of the very bare bones introduction to the game. But if you'd rather not hear any of this, of course, just skip ahead, but even then, there might be some contextual stuff in the footage that's hard to keep people from, though generally speaking, trying to avoid spoilers here. That said, the game kicks off with us on the Pioneer Station, an orbital base above the planet of Lethe. a colonized planet working for the Weyland-Yutani Company. However, as we see very quickly, aliens are brought aboard the Pioneer Station before breaking free and doing what they do best. However, this was done in a somewhat clandestine manner. Thanks to a nearby ship of colonial marines, we are able to activate the planetary defenses to keep anything from leaving the planet. However, the ship, which becomes our base, known as the Otago, has to perform an emergency landing. This then becomes our base of operations as we lead deployments around the planet itself, trying to find ways to combat the infestation. Now, that's as much as I really want to say about the story specifically, but broadly speaking, I would say it was pretty good. While much of the gameplay is the squad-based marine gameplay, they do have a few missions where we're controlling a couple of the main characters, which feed very much so into the narrative, and for the most part, I thought those were really well done. That said, about halfway through the story, give or take, a countdown starts which you need to complete the game by. However, that doesn't kick in until like halfway through the game. But even before that, you're dealing with rising levels of infestation, which we'll talk about, which can lead to other problems. But again, I enjoyed the narrative. It was better than I was really expecting it to be, and had me very interested in finding out what was going on. Next up, though, I want to talk about the progression systems of the game. This comes down to the Marines themselves that you'll be commanding on top of the base management. Now, in order to combat the alien menace, most of what we're doing is commanding squads of 4 to 5 Marines. We start out with a base number of Marines, and then as events play out and we rescue people, we can actually gain more numbers of Marines, each of which can have their own traits and specialization, which can potentially hinder or help you. However, as we complete objectives, the Marines we are using on our deployments will gain experience and level up, which provides them the opportunity to increase their usefulness to you via upgrades they get at every level, on top of purchasable upgrades that unlock as they level up as well. At level 3, each Marine can pick one of 5 classes to play as, each with their own unique style, which will give you, as their commander, different abilities to use during combat. For example, a sergeant will be able to prevent everyone's stress from rising, which is a mechanic we'll get into. Other classes can learn how to hack things, alongside bringing a drone into the deployment with you to perform certain actions, and things like a medic are pretty self-explanatory. But as this is a TRPG, while you're likely to have your favorite units, it's important to have a robust roster of Marines at play, which means that some of them will be training even if you are not actually using them on your deployments to keep their levels at least somewhat useful to you, which, as you might expect, means that managing all of these Marines is very important to our success. Some of that, however, bleeds into our base management as they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. Our base of operations is divided up into a few different sectors that we need to manage and progress through to unlock the best equipment and opportunities for our troops to succeed. And in that regard, we have our equipment, or more specifically, the weapons we'll be using as we level our Marines up, as well as find materials to use on our missions. We can bring those back and then spend it on upgrading our weapons, which will give us better damage and, again, more abilities. Each Marine can have a primary weapon, a sidearm, as well as a special weapon, and some of our skills are determined based on which of these we have equipped. Then we have Xenotech. These are temporary purchasable buffs that can be used on each individual deployment. As we start learning more and more about the aliens, we can integrate that knowledge into our own technology, which can provide a lot of fun passive benefits that will help you out. This, however, requires samples of the aliens to bring back, as well as the blueprint for the tech itself, which we can then unlock and then start using on our missions. However, while we are on said missions, as well as a little bit passively, we can potentially rescue civilians who can prove useful, specifically doctors and engineers. Engineers give us materials every day passively, which will give us more of our base resource to spend on things like equipment as well as upgrades for our Marines. Doctors, however, are arguably much more important, as our Marines can become wounded or psychologically traumatized on these missions. Wounds have to be healed in the med bay, and depending on their severity, will have a day counter associated with them. And then depending on how stressed out our Marines get on these missions, they might incur psychological trauma, which also has to be healed in the med bay. Doctors Doctors, however, are able to reduce the timers on these things outside of the psychological trauma, which can keep our favorite units in the action more often, and this combined with specific traits from our Marines leveling up that can potentially make them immune to being tired, for instance, which keeps you from deploying them back to back, or an upgrade that just removes their negative trait, for instance, are all going to keep our Marines in top fighting form. So you have to keep all of that in mind on top of the fact that days are passing. Every day consists of a mission on top of us actually ending the day. So every time we go on a mission, when our Marines come back, they will be either tired, potentially traumatized, or wounded, all of which has to be dealt with via our base resources, in addition to every time we pass a day leading to an event that we have to deal with and choose from a variety of outcomes. These can be helpful or potentially very harmful. Some can cost you your deployment for the day, or some might give you extra resources or people to work with. However, each day that passes will contribute to the planet infestation level. Every week, roughly, of in-game time, the planet infestation will increase, making our odds of success that much more difficult. There are ways to mitigate this a little bit, but generally speaking, you want to get as much done every day as you possibly can, as the alien threat is only ever growing. All of that does bring us to the gameplay and combat section. These two are somewhat tied together, so we're going to talk about them a bit at the same time here. Every day we'll be able to deploy our Marines on a mission, but one of the key things to know is that you might not necessarily complete a mission in a single day. Through a variety of factors, you might need to pull back and extract your squad, only to come back with a fresh set of Marines the next day to continue trying to push your goals. So because of that, each level, if you will, of the game is actually persistent. The progress your Marines make will stay there when you return potentially the next day with a fresh squad of Marines. At the beginning of the game, this will be 4 Marines, but at a certain point, this can be expanded to 5. You'll also have to decide how they're outfitted, which includes things like medical supplies, a generic tool resource to use on a variety of things in the environment, such as welding doors to protect yourself or interacting with certain things. We can also find sentry guns to help us fight off aliens at defensive points, some of which we can purchase with our materials before we even begin the mission, but all of that can be scrounged on the mission itself. Because playing through these missions is an interesting blend of both trying to avoid as much combat as possible while also caring for your Marines along the way. Because the two things that are likely to cause you to have to pull back from a mission are either the hive activity of the aliens themselves or your own Marines' stress levels. As we're moving through the environment, we might not necessarily need to engage in every encounter. The aliens or the cultists we might run into can be sort of stealthed around in many cases. Now for cultists, this is actually great because you can kill them stealthily in some cases without too much of a fuss. However, with the aliens, if you get seen by or kill them, it will set off a hunt. While your crew is actively being hunted, the hive activity is increasing, which is going to stress your Marines out, which you have to mitigate, on top of just making the overall alien activity even more and more aggressive. So for your Marines, you have 3 levels of stress. Every increased level of stress will add a negative modifier to that Marine. However, through things like medical supplies, you can actually mitigate the stress, and then as I mentioned earlier, the Sergeant class has an ability to stop stress gain, which can make this a little more manageable. But once detected by the aliens and the hunt begins, they will start actively coming at you until said hunt is over, which is just a set period of passing time, during which you will have to defend yourself against these, but each detection and hunt will increase the hive activity. This can be from easy, medium, or hard. Every phase upgrade comes with an onslaught, an onslaught being just a massive wave of aliens that tries to kill you, that you can potentially fend off, and then once you get to the medium and hard levels, they will start sending bigger, mutated versions of the aliens to come fight you, until this gets to a point where it's so aggressive that they are just going to kill you through attrition, if nothing else. At which point, you'll likely need to extract your Marines back to base, freshen them up, and then try again. That said, our Marines are far from useless, and this is where things get even more interesting with the real-time combat. Now, at any time, depending on your own settings, you can hit spacebar typically to pause and assess the situation and what you want to do about it. If you would prefer it just be slow instead of outright paused, that is an option as well. But while paused, we have the option to peruse the abilities available to our Marines based on their class, level, equipment, etc., which we can spend a command point to utilize. That said, we are never able to control one individual Marine. However, an individual Marine with the equipment we are trying to use does actually have to be able to use said equipment for it to happen. So if they get knocked down or something, obviously that's a problem. But we are controlling the unit, not individual members. And narratively, we're doing this from a slightly different position and just kind of walking them through the mission, so to speak. But this is important because if aliens die right next to your squad, they can potentially burst and deal acid damage, which is another reason they'll sort of grind you down through attrition if you aren't being exceedingly careful and meticulous with your defenses. Luckily, though, we are dealing with Marines here, so they are trained. They will attack anything that has detected them within range just automatically. They can attack and walk at the same time, though walking is pretty slow. So it's important when things are charging you to kind of back away from them and try to avoid that acid burst. However, beyond just that, we do have a few other options for defense, such as cover or simply sentry guns. There is a bit of a cover system which goes along with the detection. It's possible to hide behind cover to avoid detection of an enemy nearby, which will also provide cover, of course, during a firefight. And we can also set up standalone sentry guns to help us with defense or simply guard an area, which is a little bit abusable because if sentry guns kill something without you being around, that does not count as a detection, which is something that helped me out greatly. Because the aliens, as you might imagine, don't exactly spawn out of thin air. They typically spawn from hives you can find around the level. So you can set up sentry guns to sort of guard these if you know exactly where they're going to be coming from, at least until they run out of ammunition, etc. And you can also do things like set up motion trackers because we're able to see and predict enemy movements via our own motion sensor in place around our Marines. This movement detection is what's going to help us avoid enemies much of the time, even if combat eventually becomes somewhat inevitable. However, some missions actually see us outside with the tank that brought us in. The tank, or the APC, has an extremely strong gun on it and is actually immune to damage. So when we're rescuing survivors or extracting our squad, we fall back to this vehicle to do so. However, it will shoot at enemies that get close, and certain missions allow you to move this thing around, which can be used as a tactical move to help you clear enemies, or defeat onslaughts, as drawing them back to the defensive position of this thing is an incredibly good way to deal with them, though that does require you to be outside and near them. But with those things in mind, let's talk about some of the basics around exploration specifically. As we explore the maps, in addition to combat and avoiding it and everything, we can also find things like supplies, secondary objectives that typically lead us to more supplies, data that will explain what happened, or we can even make shortcuts, because while we're exploring, we have a few different resources available to you, many of which I have covered already, but another one is ammo. Every time our Marines need to reload, they consume a single unit of ammo. However, we can find it in abundance usually as we move through the level. I was never short on it. In addition to this, however, we can plant C4 charges and destroy barriers, which can help make shortcuts. And the nice thing is, while it won't necessarily show up on your minimap or your regular view, if you bring up your map, any area you've explored will actually mark all of this stuff for you so you can remember exactly where it is, which makes things like the collectible achievements really easy because, again, you can just see it on your map and you can go get it, provided you can fight your way there or stealth your way there. But another big thing while you are exploring is that a way to reduce stress is simply by having your Marines rest. Certain areas of the map will be marked safe areas, and if you seal all of the entrances to those places by using tools to weld them shut, your Marines can rest, which will reduce their stress, usually by about 1 level, alongside doing things like restoring your command points to help you move along a little better, while also adding to the tension of these aliens. And speaking of, some of my favorite things about what this game does, in addition to all of the tactical stuff, and you've probably seen it on screen here, is that they like to play around with the lighting a lot. As this is an Aliens franchise, which is typically rooted in things like horror, they play around with light and stealth and detection a lot, which makes these aliens feel like a menace, even if you're combating them regularly. Because they can hide in vents and pop out at you. They can sort of erratically move through the level as you try to hide from them to avoid detection and everything that comes with that. In certain very dark areas inside buildings, you can use your flashlight to highlight objects, which a lot of TRPGs don't really mess around with. That is to say, that lighting mechanic. And while it's not really necessary to the gameplay, I would say it adds a certain atmospheric level that is very welcome. So while individual aliens are not actually that threatening, they eventually eventually wear you down just through attrition, where a single encounter with one, which will ultimately lead to a hunt, which brings more of them down on you, and then facing onslaughts of them even, really does a good job of pushing this feeling of impending dread. But I will say one big criticism I did have of this is that because of the way that detection system works and the hive activity, it is very possible for the hunt period to end right as another alien is, say, rounding a corner, which will just immediately restart it, which was really annoying because if that happens back to back, you might as well just reload an autosave and start the mission over because it's a significant setback in many cases. Though all of that, and I haven't even told you about some of the more cinematic parts of the game where you have these really big boss fights with all different types of aliens that are much bigger, much larger, take more direct involvement to kill. And this is the part of the game where I think they really nailed it. It offers something fresh and unique while also being atmospheric in a way that makes sense for the franchise in a way I really wasn't expecting. Which is, naturally, why I mixed the gameplay and combat sections together, because they did just such a great job of blending those two elements in with each other that I really enjoyed. All of that, though, does bring us to our Steam Deck section of the game, and while this game is playable and has the features you would want, I don't know that I would recommend it. I don't think the real-time with pause tactical layer really works, at least for me, very well. If you practice a ton, I guess you might get good at it, but just the nature of the controls and trying to move everyone around in real time while I'm trying to avoid detection and everything was just very difficult on the Steam Deck. So while it has things like controller support, cloud saves, I personally found just the nature of the game itself to be very difficult to play in that format. That, combined with all of the settings have to be turned all the way down to get a decent frame rate out of it, means that while, again, you can run this on the Steam Deck, I personally didn't really enjoy it very much, simply because I don't think the mechanics lend themselves to it very well. That, though, does bring me to my positives and negatives. On the positive side, I think some of the things they did with the atmosphere and the lighting, the fact that it's real-time with pause, which is rare for a TRPG, are all things that I really enjoyed seeing here. There were times where this game felt really tense, because even though you might be able to fight said aliens that are going to be coming after you, it's a battle of attrition throughout, so it's still something you want to avoid generally, because eventually they will overwhelm you. That, combined with some of the fresh approaches to familiar systems, were very enjoyable for me as someone who plays a lot of TRPGs. While I wouldn't exactly say any of it is groundbreaking, it's done in a way where when you look at the whole package, it feels like a unique experience. And that, combined with a decent story, was enough to pull me in and have a really good time. That said, this does of course come with some negatives. The minor bugs, as I mentioned, the pathing, the textures popping in and out, just a lot of minor annoyances that can pull you back from the experience. Probably one of the most frustrating things I ran into, though, was, as I mentioned, with those hunt timers. Sometimes that timer ticks all the way to 0 just for you to immediately be seen by another alien, which kicks up the hive activity again, which feels very punishing in a way that definitely doesn't feel intended. Then my last negative is actually a really minor gripe on my part, but when you are moving your Marines, oftentimes they will kind of shout a one-liner about moving or the rest of the team being slow, etc., and it is repetitive and very loud. I wound up turning the audio down so I would just stop hearing it. All of that, though, does bring us to our conclusion. Aliens Dark Descent is a TRPG with some fresh ideas on familiar systems. And despite some minor problems, if you really enjoy this genre of games, I really think you should check this out, as it is a lot of fun. Especially since the asking price is only $40 US, and whatever that amounts to regionally. But for that price, you can have a really great time with a TRPG that, again, mixes it up a little bit. But with that in mind, the game is kind of difficult, and that is going to lead to some frustrations, which could potentially leave you with a bad experience. So I would mess around with the difficulty options a little bit before you go full tilt, especially if you're just trying this out. But for someone like myself who plays a lot of TRPGs, I really enjoyed this game and I think it's worth taking a look at, which of course means I'm giving it a buy. That, though, is everything I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. By all means, let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below, which of course means like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you're playing this one, what you think of it, because while I really enjoyed the game, I really do get the feeling that the challenge of this one might not be everybody's cup of tea. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.